Julian's wine-glass halted. "These walls have witnessed worse than a feigned engagement. Occupy yourself with the library. My company is not advisable." "Why?" she pressed, her heart aching. "Because you fear that speaking to me might remind you that you are a man, not a monument." He set his glass down with a sharp click. "I am a man of my word. I vowed this line would end. I took you to shield you, but do not confuse rescue for romance. You are here for protection, not for love." He left her alone in the crushing quiet. Driven to understand him, Clara explored. She avoided the grand rooms, drawn instead to the forbidden west wing. Behind a faded tapestry, she found a door. It opened to a small, circular study, frozen in time, his father's sanctuary, untouched since his death. On the desk lay letters, bound with a faded blue ribbon. Clara's breath caught. The seal was her brother's. She read, her hands trembling. The letters were not mere correspondence, they were a blueprint for ruin. Her brother had fabricated evidence of treason, framing Julian's father. A final frantic journal entry from the late Duke read, "The darkness they speak of is Pembroke's lie. If my death secures Julian's peace, so be it. I leave him a name in ruins, but I pray I do not leave him my shadow." The papers fluttered from Clara's hands. The madness was a fiction, but the devastating truth was Julian's belief in it. His vow of solitude was not bitterness, but terror, a belief that he carried a latent poison, a duty to spare a wife or child from a taint that did not exist. "You were never meant to see that." Julian stood in the doorway, his cravat loose, his eyes dark with fury and shame. "Julian," she whispered, rising, "it was a lie, all of it. My brother stole your father's honor and your future by making you believe you were flawed." The air in the parlor of Ashwood Manor was thick with the scent of damp wool and the bitter metallic tang of an empty grate. It had been a year since the guns had fallen silent at Waterloo, a year since the world had been remade in the image of peace, yet for Elena Crawford the war had never truly ended. It lived in the frayed hems of her black silks and the hollow silence of a house that had once echoed with laughter. They say that the dead do not speak, but in the quiet reaches of the night, Eleanor could still hear the ghost of a promise. What follows is a tale of a love that refused to be buried, a betrayal born in the smoke of battle, and the dangerous truth hidden behind a hero's mask. If this story of yearning and secrets touches your heart, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling me which historical era you find most romantic. Chapter 1. The Ghost's Final Command. The draft found its way through the ill-fitting window frames, biting at Eleanor's ankles despite the heavy weight of her mourning skirts. She sat perfectly still, a habit born of years spent under the tutelage of a mother who believed a lady's posture was her only defense against the world's cruelties. But her mother was gone, her father was drowning in a decanter of cheap port in the library, and Eleanor was left to count the stitches in her embroidery by the dying light of a winter afternoon. The silk of her gown was beginning to shine at the elbows, a subtle, humiliating sign of their dwindling fortunes. To the ton she was a tragic figure, the beautiful, impoverished fiancé of a man who had died for king and country. To the creditors she was merely a nuisance, a girl sitting on a pile of debts that grew taller than the manor's chimneys. The sudden, frantic rhythm of hooves on the gravel drive shattered the stillness. Eleanor stood, her heart performing a treacherous leap.
For a fleeting, foolish second, she allowed herself to imagine it was him, Julian, returning with a laugh and the scent of rain upon his coat. But the man who entered the parlor was not a hero. He was a courier, mud-spattered and exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from days of hard riding. He did not speak. He merely offered a small, salt-stained packet sealed with a wax crest she knew better than her own name. "From the continent, miss," the man rasped. "Found in the belongings of a fallen sergeant. It took time to reach the right hands." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The paper was thin, worn soft from being carried against a man's heart. As she unfolded it, the ghost of a scent rose from the fibers: sandalwood, leather, and the crisp, clean smell of rain. It was the scent of Julian's skin, a sensory ghost that nearly brought her to her knees. The handwriting was frantic, a sharp departure from Julian's usual elegant copperplate. The letters leaned forward as if they were racing against the very clock of fate. "My dearest, my only Eleanor, the moon is high over the Belgian fields, and tomorrow the world will change. I have no fear of the French, but I have a sudden, cold dread of the men who stand beside me. If the worst should befall me, if I do not return to lead you through the rose garden again, I beg you to remember one thing. No matter what you hear, no matter how much you ache for a piece of me, do not trust the man who brings you my sword. He is a viper in a gentleman's coat. Protect yourself, my love. Protect Ashwood. I will find my way back to you, in this life or the next." The letter ended abruptly, a jagged ink blot marking the place where he must have been called away. Elena pressed the parchment to her lips, a dry paper tasting of old salt and ancient promises. Her mind raced back to the day Julian's sabre had been returned to her. It had been delivered with such solemnity, such practiced grief, by Baron Vane. Vane had been Julian's friend, or so she had thought. He had stood in this very room, his voice thick with emotion, as he described Julian's valiant end in the thick of the fray. He had been the one to offer his hand in support, the one to fend off the first wave of debt collectors. And now Julian's voice, reaching across the chasm of death, was screaming a warning. That night Elena did not sleep. She lay in her cold bed, the letter tucked beneath her pillow, feeling the sharp edges of the paper against her skin. Outside, the wind howled through the oaks, sounding like the distant thunder of cannon. She was a woman alone, surrounded by ruin, and the only man she had ever loved had just warned her from the grave that her saviour was in fact her executioner. The carriage that rattled up the drive of Ashwood Manor 2 days later did not carry the mud of the battlefield or the desperation of a courier. It was a sleek, black-lacquered vehicle pulled by 4 perfectly matched bays that cost more than Elena's entire dowry. It was the carriage of a man who owned the world and felt no guilt for it. Baron Vane stepped out, his boots polished to a mirror shine that seemed an insult to the faded carpets of the entrance hall. He was a man of 40, with features that were handsome in a sharp, brittle way, like a piece of flint that might spark if struck, or simply cut the hand that held it. Chapter 2. The Baron and the Dead. The tea service was a mockery of hospitality. The pot was chipped and the biscuits were stale, but Baron Vane sat in the armchair across from Elena as if he were occupying a throne. He watched her with a heavy, hooded gaze that made her skin crawl, a look that felt less like admiration and more like an appraisal of fine porcelain. "You look pale, Elena," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. "Mourning does not suit a woman of your vitality. It has been a year.
The world moves on even if you insist on standing still in this drafty tomb. Elena kept her spine rigid, Julian's letter a scorching weight against her ribs where she had tucked it into her stays. Respect for the dead is not a matter of suitability, my lord. It is a matter of the heart. Vane smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. The heart is a fickle organ. It beats for what it needs, and right now what you need is security. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a sheaf of papers, laying them on the scarred mahogany table between them. Your father was a man of many passions, Elena. Unfortunately, his greatest passion was the faro table at White's. Elena's breath hitched. She knew of her father's gambling, but the sheer volume of the papers suggested a catastrophe. Ashwood is gone, Vane said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. He wagered the house, the lands, and the very chair you are sitting on. I hold the deeds, every acre, every stone. By the end of the month, the bailiffs will be here to turn you and that broken man you call a father into the street. The room seemed to tilt. Elena gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. Why are you telling me this? If you intended to ruin us, you would have sent a lawyer. Vane leaned forward, the scent of expensive snuff and something cold, like iron, overwhelming the faint sandalwood memory of Julian. I do not want the house, Eleanor. I want the woman Julian Crawford was so determined to keep for himself. I offer you a mercy, a trade. Marry me, and the debts are burned. You remain mistress of Ashwood, and your father is spared the poorhouse. It was a trap, elegant and absolute, but it was the way he spoke Julian's name, with a flick of his tongue, as if it were a bitter taste, that chilled her. You were his friend, she whispered, the betrayal tasting like ash. You brought me his sword. I brought you a piece of scrap metal, Vane spat, his composure cracking to reveal a jagged edge of obsession. He was always the golden boy, wasn't he, the hero of the regiment, but heroes are remarkably fragile when the lead begins to fly. He stood and walked toward her, reaching out to touch the small, delicate locket at her throat, the last gift Julian had given her before he sailed for the continent. Eleanor flinched, but he caught her chin, forcing her to look at him. Wear the sapphires tonight. His voice dropped to a low, possessive hiss. The ones he gave you for your 18th birthday. I want to see them against your skin while you give me your answer. I want to see his ghost realize that everything he loved now belongs to me. He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. Do not weep for him, Eleanor. He wasn't the man you think. At Waterloo, when the line broke, your hero didn't stand his ground. He turned, he ran. He died with his back to the enemy, crying like a child. He was a coward, and I am the man who had to cover his shame. He released her, leaving her trembling in the sudden silence of the room. Every instinct she possessed screamed that he was lying, that Julian, who had once climbed a burning stable to save a foal, could never be a coward. But the weight of the debt was real, the deeds were real. As Vane walked toward the door, he paused, looking back at her with a chilling triumph. Think on it, Elena. A coward's memory will not keep you warm this winter. I will. When the front door finally clicked shut, Elena collapsed onto the settee, her hand flying to the hidden letter. Do not trust the man who brings you my sword. Julian had known. Even then, in the chaos of war, he had seen the shadow of Vane's soul. But knowing the truth was one thing, surviving it was another.
She was a prisoner in her own home, and the walls were closing in. The village of Oakhaven was a place where secrets were usually as thin as the local ale, yet the arrival of the new stable hand at the Black Swan Inn had set every tongue from the blacksmith's forge to the vicarage tea-table wagging in earnest. He had arrived on a night of driving rain, a tall, broad-shouldered spectre who called himself Silas. He spoke rarely, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like stones grinding together in a deep well. Most striking, however, was the leather mask that obscured the left side of his face, a jagged piece of hide that vanished beneath the collar of a heavy, midnight blue cloak he refused to shed, even as the summer sun began to bake the Sussex soil. The villagers whispered of a fire at the front, a phrase that had become a shorthand for the horrors no one wanted to name. They saw the way he moved, with the disciplined grace of a soldier, and they left him to his shadows.
Chapter 3. The Man in the Shadows. Elena found herself drawn to the village more often than was strictly necessary. The atmosphere at Ashwood Manor had become suffocating. Baron Vane was a frequent unwanted guest, his presence a cold shroud over her every thought. To breathe, she needed the open road, even if the road only led to the modest shops of Oakhaven. It was on one such afternoon, as the sky bruised with the threat of a summer storm, that the axle of her aging carriage finally gave way. With a sickening crack of splintering wood, the vehicle lurched violently to the left, groaning to a halt in a cloud of dry road dust just yards from the inn stable yard. "Miss Elena, are you unhurt?" her driver, old Miller, called out, though he looked as though he might faint from the shock himself. "I am fine, Miller," she replied, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She reached for the door handle, but before she could turn it, the door was wrenched open from the outside. A man stood there. He was massive, blocking out the light of the waning sun. The heavy cloak swirled around his boots, and the leather mask gave him the appearance of a dark, tragic brigand from a Bronte novel. Silas. He didn't speak, he didn't offer a polite greeting or ask for permission. He simply reached into the dark carriage and placed his hands around her waist to lift her down. The moment his palms met the silk of her gown, a jolt of pure, unadulterated lightning scorched through Elena. It wasn't the clumsy, grasping touch of the Baron, nor was it the tentative reach of a stranger. It was a contact that felt known. His grip was firm, yet there was an underlying tenderness to the way he handled her, as if she were made of the finest Venetian glass. For a heartbeat, she was suspended in the air, her face inches from his.
She could see his eyes, the only part of his face truly visible. They were a piercing, stormy grey, swirling with an intensity that made her breath hitch. There was a flicker of something there, agony, recognition, and a hunger so profound it felt like a silent prayer. He set her on the ground with agonizing slowness. His hands lingered on her waist for a second too long, the heat of his skin seeping through her layers of mourning. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas gave a curt, stiff nod. He stepped back into the shadows of the stable door, his movements jagged, as if he were fighting the urge to say something or to reach for her again. He disappeared into the gloom of the hay-scented barn before she could utter another word. Days passed, but the memory of that touch haunted Elena's sleep, more persistent than even the Baron's threats. She found herself at the parish church later that week, seeking the only peace she knew. The Crawford family's cenotaph stood in a lonely corner of the graveyard, a marble monument to a man whose body was said to lie in an unmarked trench in Belgium. Elena knelt in the long grass, pressing her forehead against the cool stone. "Julian," she breathed, the name a sob. "I don't know what to do. The world is getting darker, and I am so tired of fighting alone." She felt a prickle of awareness on the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. She turned her head slowly. Near the edge of the yew trees, half hidden by the shifting shadows of the branches, stood Silas. He wasn't working, he wasn't tending to a horse. He was simply standing there, his gaze fixed on her with a devastating yearning. He looked like a man watching a miracle he wasn't allowed to touch. There was no malice in his stir, only a profound, echoing loneliness that mirrored her own. Elena stood, her hand going instinctively to the letter hidden in her bodice. She wanted to call out to him, to ask why a stable hand looked at her as if he knew the very shape of her soul. But as she took a step toward him, the wind picked up, tossing the branches of the yews, and by the time the leaves settled, the man in the mask was gone, leaving only the scent of sandalwood and rain lingering in the damp afternoon air. Chapter 4. The Ledger of the Lost. The humidity of the afternoon hung like a heavy curtain over Oakhaven, promising a storm that refused to break. Elena felt the weight of it in her bones as she stepped into the common room of the Black Swan Inn. Baron Vane had sent her on an errand of calculated cruelty to settle a mounting tab for the wine and spirits he'd had delivered to Ashwood, a task that served only to remind her that he now held the purse strings of her life. The inn was a cacophony of clinking pewter and low masculine murmurs. It smelled of stale ale, pipe smoke, and the damp sawdust strewn across the floorboards. "Ah, Miss Crawford," Mr. Thig, the innkeeper, squeaked, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. "Right sorry state of affairs, that." "The state of my affairs is not your concern, Mr. Fig," Elena replied, her voice maintaining a frosty elegance that belied the trembling in her hands. "The Baron's bill, if you please." The innkeeper scuttled behind the heavy oak bar, rummaging through a stack of papers. Right. Just need to verify the last delivery dates in the guest ledger. One moment, miss." He heaved a massive, leather-bound book onto the scarred surface of the bar, flipping through the yellowed pages with stained fingers. A sudden shout from the kitchen, a crash of breaking pottery and a string of curses sent Mr. Fig scurrying away, leaving the ledger open and unattended. Elena glanced toward the door, her heart hammering. She shouldn't look. It was a breach of propriety, a common intrusion. But her eyes were drawn to the page, searching for the Baron's name, for some evidence of his greed. Instead, her gaze caught on a small, ink-smudged doodle in the bottom right margin of the current week's entries. It was a letter E. It wasn't a standard clerk's script. It was a specific, whimsical construction, the vertical spine of the letter slightly curved, the 3 horizontal bars ending in tiny, elegant loops, like the unfurling tendrils of a vine. The breath left Elena's lungs in a sharp, painful rush. She knew that E. She had seen it 1,000 times in the margins of her Greek primers, on the backs of discarded maps, and in the sand of the Ashwood Creek. It was Julian's signature doodle, a nervous habit he'd had since they were children. He used to say he couldn't think of anything else when he held a pen, so his hand simply drew the first letter of her name. With trembling fingers, she pulled the hidden letter from her bodice, the one the courier had brought. She laid the parchment beside the ledger. She didn't need a magnifying glass to see the truth. The slant of the T was sharp, like a soldier's salute. The pressure on the H was heavy at the base, as if the writer had paused to gather his thoughts. Every stroke, every idiosyncratic curve was a match.
The man who had written this ledger entry, the man who was currently working in the stables for a pittance, was the same man who had written her the warning from the fields of Waterloo.
He is alive. The realization didn't bring joy, it brought a terrifying, dizzying confusion. If he was alive, why had he sent his sword? Why had he allowed the world to mourn him? Why had he watched her from the shadows of the churchyard, masked and silent, while she wept at an empty grave? She looked through the grime-streaked window of the inn toward the stables. Through the open doors, she could see the silhouette of the man called Silas. He was heaving a bale of hay, his muscles straining against the fabric of his shirt. He moved with a grace that no common laborer possessed, a grace she had once waltzed with in a ballroom lit by 1,000 candles. He wasn't a ghost, he wasn't a memory, he was flesh and blood, hiding behind a mask of leather and a name that wasn't his. "Everything in order, miss?" Mr. Figg asked, returning to the bar and snapping the ledgers shut. Elena jumped, her heart racing. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice sounding as if it were coming from a great distance. "Everything is exactly as it should be." She paid the bill with cold, numb fingers and walked out into the oppressive heat. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splashing against the dust. She didn't head for her carriage. Instead, she turned toward the stables, her resolution hardening like tempered steel. She had lived a year in a funeral shroud of lies, and she would not spend another hour in the dark. Chapter 5. The Storm of Revelation. The sky finally broke. What had begun as a sultry afternoon collapsed into a chaotic deluge, the clouds rupturing to pour a frantic, cleansing rain over the valley. Elena didn't care for her silks or the ruin of her bonnet. She ran, her boots slipping in the rising mud, toward the derelict barn at the edge of the inn's property, where she knew the stable hand took his meals in solitude. The barn groaned under the assault of the wind, its ancient timbers shrieking. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dry grain and the sharp ozone tang of the storm. Silas stood by a shuttered window, his back to her, watching the lightning illuminate the hills. "Julian!" She didn't whisper it, she threw the name at him like a challenge. The man didn't move, but she saw his shoulders lock. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder. "The ledger!" she cried out over the roar of the rain on the tin roof. "I saw the E. I know the slant of your hand as well as I know the beat of my own heart. Turn around, look at me, and tell me you are a stranger." He turned slowly, the movement heavy with a year's worth of exhaustion. "You should have stayed in the house, Elena," he rasped. The voice was no longer a gravelly disguise. Beneath the roughness, the melodic resonance of Julian Crawford returned, breaking her heart all over again. "You died," she sobbed, stepping closer until she could see the pulse jumping in his throat. "They brought me your sword. They told me you were a coward. Vane told me—" "Vane is a murderer," Julian snarled, the mask of the stable hand falling away to reveal the soldier. He reached up, his fingers trembling, and unlaced the leather mask. Elena gasped, but not in horror. A jagged, silvered scar ran from her temple to her jaw, a map of fire and pain, but it could not hide the man she loved. His face was leaner, harder, but it was him. "He didn't bring you my sword out of duty," Julian said, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective rage. "He brought it because he thought he had finished me. At Waterloo, during the final advance, it wasn't a French musket that took me down. I saw him, Elena. I saw Vane draw his pistol. He shot me in the back so he could claim my life, my honor, and you." Elena felt the world spinning. "But the desertion, he says you ran." "He framed me.
Julian took a step toward her, the heat radiating from him in waves. He used his influence to mark me a coward, so that if I survived, I could never show my face in England without a noose waiting for me. I've spent this year in the shadows, recovering in a peasant's hut, gathering the letters and the witnesses to prove his treason. I was coming for him, Elena. I was coming to burn his world down. "You let me mourn you," she whispered, a single tear tracking through the rain on her cheek. "I had to keep you safe. If he knew I lived, he would have used you to draw me out." He reached for her then, his hands framing her face with a desperation that shook his entire frame. "But I saw him with you. I saw how he touched you. I realized I'd rather be hanged as a deserter than let that monster have one more hour of your life." In the middle of the ruined barn, with the storm screaming around them, Julian pulled her into his arms. The year of death, the black silks, and the Baron's cold threats washed away in a flood of salt and rain. He kissed her, not with the gentle restraint of the boy who had left, but with the raw, terrifying hunger of a man who had crawled back from the gates of hell to claim what was his. "I didn't survive a war and a betrayal just to lose you now," he vowed against her lips. "The storm is here, Elena, but when it clears, the Baron will be the one in the shadows, and we will finally be home." As the thunder rolled into the distance, Elena realized that the fire Julian had endured hadn't destroyed him, it had forged him into the shield she so desperately needed. They stood together in the dark, two souls mended by the very truth that had sought to break them. The war was finally over, and the dawn, though distant, promised a light that no Baron could ever extinguish.